A young man named Elmas awoke in terror, haunted by a nightmare reminding him that he needed to leave, for this place was not meant for him. He had never been able to remain in one location for long since he was a child, and this time he had managed to stay only a week. Nightmares began tormenting him whenever he lingered in one place for too long. As soon as he awakened from the horrors, the fear and anxiety that gripped him compelled him to move again. For this reason, he was forced to live the precarious life of a mercenary. Eventually, he reached the capital, though the place bore no resemblance to a sorcerer's residence. At the entrance, the master of the house, named Sul, greeted him and noted that the protagonist had seemingly come because of rumors. This piqued Sul's curiosity, as he wondered whether the old witch was still alive, though the guest sincerely had no idea what he meant. As they stepped inside, the sorcerer asked Elmas to keep his distance, claiming he detested the scent of dogs. This statement surprised Elmas, for he had never noticed such a scent on himself. Soon, he was met by the other residents of the house, who reassured him there was no cause for concern, as they too noticed nothing strange. The master simply had a deep hatred for wolves, which explained his rude demeanor. In any case, the sorcerer demanded an update on the preparations. As it turned out, everything was already complete, and they could begin at any moment upon his command. However, he had to be mindful that there were no spare rooms in case of failure, so utmost care was needed with every step. In the guest chamber, the master inquired whether the purpose of Elmas's visit was related to his injured arm, which appeared rather painful. Elmas, having grown used to such questions, explained that he had sought help from everyone he could, but they merely shrugged at the sight of him. Thus, he had pinned his hopes on receiving aid here, as the witch had told him that the master of this house was the only one capable of helping him. In response, the sorcerer remarked that he had never given the old woman permission to spread lies about him. Yet his thoughts quickly shifted, for standing before him was a fascinating subject for study, one surrounded by a web of intriguing mysteries. In other words, this promised to be a thrilling endeavor. If only the young man were not a wolf, he might have been able to ask him directly. The sorcerer was irritated, but at the same time could hardly contain his anticipation. Perhaps this truly was a wolf, yet studying him might also assist in repairing the laboratory. As expected, curiosity won out in such dilemmas. Thus, the guest was first ordered to undress, as his internal energy streams needed to be examined, and this could not be done accurately through clothing. His body, though strong, was covered in scars, a clear testament to the life he had led. In any case, the sorcerer placed a finger on the stump where his arm had once been, and faint traces of energy began to emerge. The wolf boy remained silent, though it was easy to tell the experience was unpleasant for him. Still, the sorcerer concluded, based on the response, that what he was dealing with was a spell. This discovery was deeply intriguing, prompting him to continue the examination, tracing his finger along the paths of energy flow. However, as the energy coursed through particularly sensitive areas of the body, the guest's reactions became increasingly noticeable. Before him stood a mercenary, and yet the innocent reactions of a body hardened by countless battles seemed strangely out of place. It gave the impression that someone was trying to seduce him. However, if that were the case, he felt compelled to disappoint the young man. Though Elmas might have been to his taste, the sorcerer avoided entangling himself with the first naked boy he encountered. Suddenly the sorcerer leaned closer, remarking as he did so that he had not immediately noticed something due to the pervasive scent of a dog. Before he could finish, a flustered subordinate burst in, interrupting him and urgently reporting that a problem had arisen. When asked what had happened, the skeletal servant explained that a stone bridge in the nearby park had been destroyed. There were far too many attackers for them to handle alone. Faced with this, all they could do was wait while the sorcerer tried to summon reinforcements. In the end, the operator reported that the person he was calling was not answering, which only stoked Saul's growing fury. Meanwhile, Elmas decided to press the issue, asking whether the sorcerer truly had the power to heal his arm. But Sul was too preoccupied to entertain such discussions, his frustration mounting as the critical contact continued to ignore his calls. Nevertheless, the protagonist insisted that if he could receive a definitive answer now, he would agree to sign a contract. It was at this point that Sul finally began to grasp the situation. His guest was a mercenary and might prove useful in this crisis. The wolf himself assured them of his strength, claiming he was more than capable of completing the task without dying in the process. It was undeniably a compelling offer. At last, the assurance Elmas sought was given. The sorcerer promised that he truly could heal his arm. Even though he did not yet know how, he vowed to find a way and offered his word on it. At that moment, he cast a special spell before him, a mark of mana that served as a seal of their agreement. Within seconds, the mark began to fade, signifying that Elmas had accepted the task. In conclusion, he needed to complete the mission assigned to him and return to receive his promised treatment. Shortly thereafter, they stepped onto the balcony from where the entire surrounding area was visible. When asked if the mercenary could sense them, Elmas confirmed that he could hear them clearly. With that, he was ready to begin the task. Though he was reluctant to use his abilities, Gidam had assured him that the sorcerer's mana could be trusted. Upon landing, he immediately activated his combat form. In this state, he was able to reach the site of the main conflict with remarkable speed. Meanwhile, the sorcerer's subordinates were running for their lives, desperately trying to protect a precious case. Pursued by enemies, they were forced to fend off attacks as they fled. The skeletal servant, however, once again reiterated his ominous warning. This would not end well. Regardless of what happened to them, the cargo had to be protected at all costs. Lycanthropes, as legends told, could transform from human to wolf under the full moon's influence, and it seemed the moon was exerting its pull on them now. On the other hand, Elmas noticed that his leaps had grown far higher compared to when he first transformed. That day had been marked by a brutal battle, one that could easily have been his last. Much like himself, his comrades were utterly exhausted, but just as Elmas decided to check if they were all right, they turned on another mercenary, unleashing a barrage of gunfire with every weapon they had. Elmas was utterly unprepared for such a reaction. After all, he had fought not only for his survival, but for theirs as well. Yet they saw him differently. To them, he was a monster. But Elmas refused to accept this label. He was not the beast they claimed he was. Meanwhile, the sorcerer's servants had reached a desperate state as they waited for aid. And just as they began to beg their master for assistance, that very help appeared before them, as if summoned by their cries. Despite his sudden arrival, the servants showed no signs of surprise. However, that was of no concern to him. Standing before him now was his target, one he was destined to defeat. Each new enemy fell to Elmas with ease, a testament to his skill as a seasoned professional. Even the sorcerer's servants acknowledged the immense strength he possessed. Sorcerers were renowned for harnessing and storing mana, the natural energy of the world, within their bodies. But when Sul attempted to cast his own magic, his body began to crumble into ash with terrifying swiftness. It was as if he were a vampire succumbing to sunlight. Still, this ordeal was nearing its end, and his long imprisonment would soon be over. All his hopes rested on the fruit-bearing tree of this world. In the meantime, the protagonist had completed his task. All that remained was to survey the surroundings, ensuring the area was finally secure. Once he was satisfied that it was, he allowed himself to revert to his human form at last. But suddenly, a sharp pain tore through his chest, causing him to stagger. The servants he had saved looked on in confusion, unable to comprehend what was happening. After all, the lycanthrope had sustained no visible injuries, and there was no clear reason for this agony. Upon closer examination, however, the horrifying truth became evident. His body was beginning to break apart. It became painfully clear to everyone that if they didn't act immediately, this man would simply cease to exist. Suddenly, the briefcase they had so desperately protected began to move toward the mercenary, as if pulled by some unseen force. Though none of them understood what was happening, they could only assume that this object might hold the key to saving the wolf. At last, the force drew the briefcase to him and it opened, revealing something the sorcerer had long sought. Inside was a luminous stone of an unknown origin, glowing with an otherworldly brilliance. Without warning, the stone rose, as though possessed by its own consciousness and power, and plunged itself directly into the mercenary's chest. As the fusion took place, his body ceased its collapse and instead began to regenerate with astonishing speed. However, the strain of this experience was far beyond what any ordinary being could endure, and Elmas promptly lost consciousness. The sorcerer's servants, meanwhile, could only wonder what their master's next move would be. The unconscious guest was carefully placed in a bed to recover, as they waited for him to awaken. Watching over him was a grim and brooding figure, his expression as dark as if something had occurred that should never have happened under any circumstances. In his hands, he toyed with a scalpel, as though deliberating whether to use it or not. The servants observed him from a distance and soon reached a unanimous conclusion. Their master was utterly terrifying when angry. Despite the vampire boy's reassurances, the skeletal servant remained convinced that things would turn out fine, dismissing the cause of the events as irrelevant. But clearly, he didn't know everything that had led to such a treacherous act. A loyal subordinate stood in his path, fully aware of just how important the fruit was. Even so, the servant pleaded for the sorcerer to trust in Calva's loyalty, pointing out that the act had not been one of free will. Above all, Calva had acted to save them, sacrificing his own strength without hesitation. Moreover, there had to be a way to recover the fruit without killing the wolf. In response, the sorcerer snapped, stating that the skeleton's constant meddling had irritated him since the day he created him, always lecturing and trying to teach him something. Perhaps one day, he mused aloud, he would turn him back into nothing more than a pile of bones. The guest began to stir only as the day drew to a close. It had been a long time since he had felt so rested, and Elmas realized he hadn't slept this well in ages. But what truly shocked him was the presence of a second arm. It was utterly impossible, and the lycanthrope was visibly disoriented. His confusion lasted until it was explained to him that he had absorbed the fruit of the world tree, the very fruit from which the world itself had been created. The briefcase had contained this legendary fruit, which blooms only once every 1,000 years, and which was of immense importance to their plans. However, his heart had consumed the fruit entirely, leaving not a trace behind. This left one pressing question. What would they do now? Elmas was given a choice, to die or to continue his existence. Naturally, he had no desire to die and expressed his willingness to do whatever it took to survive. At that moment, something unexpected occurred, and in response, he was sternly warned to remember his words and not to think of going back on them later. This was far from an ordinary kiss. For the sorcerer, it was an unconventional method to pinpoint the exact location of the mercenary's weakness. Elmas, however, had no understanding of what was happening, and the unexpected gesture completely caught him off guard. As soon as it was over, before he could utter a single word, magical chains suddenly appeared on his arm. Before the mercenary had a chance to react, he was pressed down onto the bed, urged to remain calm. He was warned that if he truly wished to stay alive, his best course of action would be to cooperate. These words seemed to work, and Sul resumed his search for the precise weak point he so desperately needed to find. Finally, he discovered it, a spot where the power of the fruit resonated with the greatest intensity. Elmas, in turn, was overwhelmed by the strangeness of the sensation. He had never felt anything like it before in his life, but all he wanted now was to make it stop. Eventually, the sorcerer concluded that while it might not have been a direct connection, the power was still incredible. Meanwhile, his test subject demanded to know what was going on and how all of this was connected to his life. When he had said he was willing to do whatever was necessary, he had meant dying if need be. Not this. Yet a promise had been made, and there was no escaping it now. At that moment, Sul revealed that within Elmas's body was now a magical explosive capable of tearing him apart from the inside at any time. The protagonist, however, already knew of the magic in his heart. A shaman he had met earlier had explained that there was a high-level spell placed on his heart to suppress his lycanthropy. This revelation surprised even the sorcerer, who had been unaware of it. Only now did he begin to understand how Elmas was connected to the world tree. It was all tied to the spell, but the issue lay in the fact that the magic was fractured, fragile, and could collapse from the slightest disturbance. Elmas suggested that the power of the fruit might have been the cause of this instability. This was true, but the fruit's energy itself had not directly disrupted the spell. To seal the power of the tree, the membranes of the magical barrier needed to be replaced. If this was unacceptable, there was another, faster way to address the issue. However, no one could guarantee his safety in pursuing it. The alternative involved simply ripping his heart out. When asked why he needed towels, Sul cryptically mentioned another issue that needed resolving. This realization filled the werewolf with deep embarrassment. For the sorcerer, however, it was nothing more than an excuse for amusement. Shortly after, the master of the house made his way to the library, where another set of doors awaited him. Beyond those doors was what seemed to be an entirely different world, hidden within his estate. Without hesitation, Sul stepped forward and spoke an incantation. Within moments, green shoots began to sprout from the desolate land around him. This marked the current limits of his ability. It would take more effort to restore the area fully, and time was not on their side. Meanwhile, the guest was left wondering why his body was reacting in such a way to all of this. Some time had passed, and the servants of the house gathered around the table where the meal had already been served, awaiting their master's arrival. Calva, confident that Sul would appear soon, couldn't help but wonder why the wolf had yet to leave his room. It turned out that Elmas hadn't responded when they knocked on his door, and he was told that it was unwise to open doors unless someone replied. Barely a few minutes later, the master himself appeared, curious about the topic of their conversation. Smirking suddenly, Sul asked whether the wolf still hadn't come out. With that, he decided to investigate for himself why Elmas was still in his room. Receiving no response, Sul entered uninvited, and what he saw left him surprised. After a brief realization, he dismissed the servants, instructing them to eat without him, as it was clear this matter would take some time. Meanwhile, Elmas was struggling to calm himself and stop his overwhelming reactions, as despite the passage of time, nothing had changed. The master of the house, arriving at the most inconvenient moment, inquired if Elmas was perhaps doing this on purpose. Unprepared to face anyone, the protagonist immediately tried to drive the sorcerer out of the room. Yet Sul was quick to point out that he had misunderstood his intentions entirely. Saul soon deduced why Elmas had been waiting in his room all this time. Still, even with his sharp intellect, he couldn't fathom why the wolf was now pushing him away, given that the contract had already been sealed. In the end, Sul remarked that nothing of the sort was going to happen, but it still seemed as though Elmas was waiting for him despite his denials. Elsewhere, someone was taking a phone call from a subordinate who admitted to having failed in their mission. As it turned out, they had been defeated by a wolf with golden fur. This revelation startled the man, causing him to momentarily lose his composure. However, he quickly regained control and resumed the conversation, during which it was revealed that inquiries had been made among the clans, but the wolf didn't belong to any of them. Likely, it was some kind of stray. As soon as the call ended, the man realized something with sudden clarity. He had finally found Elmas. At the same time, the protagonist thought he heard someone calling his name, though no voice was actually audible nearby. In any case, he dismissed the thought as no one knew his real name. Everything that had happened recently was extraordinary, but now he found himself wondering whether it might be better to run away. That day, the sorcerer had confessed that what they were doing was only the beginning. By continuing, he explained, they could extract the power more quickly, an arrangement that would benefit them both. Regardless, the protagonist couldn't back out now, not as long as the fruit's energy flowed within him. Saul offered him a bit of time to mentally prepare, stating that forcing him wasn't his style. Instead, he suggested Elmas try to enjoy it, as this was something they would have to do whether he liked it or not. At that moment, the werewolf fully realized that he had incurred a debt so immense it could never be repaid. Eventually, he presented himself before his partner, who immediately remarked that he had expected the guest to flee at the first opportunity. In response, the protagonist commented that people often said sorcerers were the most stubborn creatures in existence, and if one held a grudge, there was no escaping it, even in death. Saul chuckled, affirming that such stubbornness was indeed what defined sorcerers. Moreover, he noted that Elmas seemed to know an awful lot about them, more than any ordinary human should. In any case, there was work to be done. They had discovered something that could potentially serve as a replacement for the fruit, and it was the mercenary's task to retrieve it. When asked what it was, the sorcerer uttered a single word: Udumbara. Elmas, skeptical, dismissed it as a fictional flower. In response, Sul pointed out that they were dealing with a sorcerer and a werewolf, and in this world, anything was possible, including Udumbara. The protagonist admitted he hadn't considered that, but also requested that Sul stop pestering him unnecessarily. This reaction surprised the sorcerer, who asked if Elmas couldn't simply stop overthinking and reconsider his attitude. But the mercenary firmly decided he couldn't just accept it. It was all too much for him to handle. Sul had no choice but to relent, remarking that if he said he would wait, then he would wait. He was prepared to wait as long as necessary. After a brief conversation, it became clear that neither of them actually knew what Udumbara looked like. To aid in finding the elusive flower, Kuda was assigned to accompany Elmas. That same evening, the two set off on their mission. However, an awkward silence hung between them, making the protagonist increasingly uneasy. At one point, he couldn't take it anymore and asked Kuda what the problem was. It turned out that the small vampire had been wanting to ask permission to bite him for a long time, driven by an intense curiosity to taste a werewolf. When met with a sharp refusal, Kuda quietly muttered that the creature beside him smelled incredibly delicious. But since he couldn't have a taste, wolves were simply the worst. In that case, he asked, what was the wolf's name? Without much thought, the protagonist introduced himself as L. Since it seemed to be time for introductions, Kuda revealed his name as well, adding that the skeleton was Kalva and their master was Sul. However, the mercenary wasn't particularly interested in any of this at the moment. They had arrived at the designated location. Instead of entering, though, his companion pointed out that their target had already been found. Ahead of them stood a young girl who, while not as enticingly fragrant as Elle, still had a scent Kuda found appealing. After a brief conversation with the girl, she curtly and decisively refused their request. She couldn't understand why she should follow strangers she had just met. When asked if she knew who Sul was, she tersely assured them that she had never heard of anyone by that name. In fact, she added, they were the first people she had seen in 40 years. At that moment, an unfamiliar elderly woman emerged onto the street. The girl lit up with joy upon seeing her and immediately decided to follow her, remarking to the others that at least she trusted this person. As it became clear that the situation would not be resolved so easily, they began to realize that there were still details they were unaware of. Nevertheless, Udambara began to seriously consider their words. After all, if sorcerers truly existed, then... That evening, Sul saw his subordinates return empty-handed. It turned out that the mercenary had refused to resort to abducting someone. He explained that he was helping only because the fruit was within him, but he had no intention of committing crimes in the process. The master responded with understanding, acknowledging that if this was truly the case, he would not force him. Meanwhile, Kuda had managed to sketch a portrait of the person they needed. This intrigued Sul, as he hadn't expected the flower to take on a human form. He also wondered aloud why it had already bloomed, as it was unlikely the time had come. It was evident that when their master became so lost in thought, he was deaf to everything around him. In such moments, the werewolf had his own method for snapping him back to reality. A sharp, unpleasant sound pierced the sorcerer's ears, instantly pulling him out of his reverie and killing any desire he had to dwell on his thoughts further. Immediately after, Sul commented that communication was, in fact, the most important part of human relationships. Saul agreed to explain further, but requested that El change his expression, as seeing such a face made him feel like forcing the wolf to cry. The mercenary, repulsed by the comment, retorted aloud, asking if all sorcerers were this devoid of conscience. The sorcerer assured him that there was no one else like him in the entire world, and suggested that El start appreciating what he had. In any case, the mercenary wanted an explanation as to why it was strange that Udambara had taken on a human form. It turned out that the flower bloomed only once every 3,000 years, and the last recorded bloom had been 2,900 years ago. The protagonist hypothesized that if the flower adopted a human form during its blooming, this likely meant the time had come. This was true, which was precisely why it was so strange. Sul had never expected to find it, as it bloomed only once in a generation, and yet here it was, unexpectedly appearing. For this reason, the sorcerer refused to sleep until he uncovered the true cause of these events. The following day, the skeleton suggested that the guests join him for dinner, as they only needed to set out a few more spoons. However, El wasn't feeling well, not since that very moment. As he dwelled on the thought, the master of the house suddenly appeared behind him. It turned out they had previously agreed that Sul would neutralize the fruit's power once a day, and now the time had come. Despite the protagonist's request to be warned about such things, the sorcerer seemed uninterested in such formalities. Instead, it became apparent that they were about to have a visitor. Staring at the enormous building cloaked in a dark, foreboding aura, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had come to the wrong place. To anyone else, this structure might have resembled a bottle brimming with poison, menacing and uninviting. Suddenly, she was approached by one of the residents of the house, Kuda, who assured her that the master had instructed her not to flee, as permission had already been granted for her to enter. Meanwhile, the protagonist felt an unusual heat coursing through his body, sincerely hoping it was merely a side effect of the fruit. Yet it could also have been the result of what had happened to him not long ago. Now he understood why others couldn't restrain themselves during such moments. Regardless, the servants led their guest inside. Standing before her, Sul quickly concluded that what he was witnessing was only a partial awakening. The time for full blooming had not yet arrived, which explained his surprise that she was able to wander freely. It turned out she had not yet bloomed at all. Even so, she should have been far weaker. After all, it had been nearly 1,000 years. The guest, unable to hold back, declared that the master of the house was incredibly rude and that no true sorcerer would behave this way. Saul had no intention of getting angry. Instead, he dryly remarked that they had a rather aggressive puppy on their hands. In response, she retorted that the puppy had sharp, hidden teeth and that the sorcerer's narrow-minded thinking hardly reflected that of a true wizard. In the meantime, a servant brought some snacks for the guests and invited everyone to sit while the conversation continued. However, the guest was far too proud to sit here. Sul, on the other hand, had already deduced that she could not fully materialize due to a lack of energy. When asked what he had done, the sorcerer demonstrated by tossing a spoon at her, which bounced off as though striking a solid object. He explained that since they were on his territory, he could do whatever he pleased here. Elsewhere that evening, an old woman was busy brewing tea while waiting for someone. At one point, she asked aloud if the individual had arrived yet, and then, a second later, confidently answered her own question. Yes, she was already here. When asked how she could be so certain, the woman simply replied that she just knew. She had prepared 2 servings of tea, despite Udumbara reminding her that she could not drink anything. Still, the hostess noted that she hadn't felt the girl's presence for a long time and simply wanted to ensure that nothing bad had happened. On the contrary, everything seemed fine. There was no need for worry. Perhaps their long-held dreams were on the verge of becoming reality. After all, Udumbar had finally encountered a sorcerer. He may have been rude, but he seemed powerful enough. And, intriguingly, his house even contained a living skeleton. The conversation was cut short when one of the participants dozed off at the table. In truth, the girl was more worried about the old woman. She believed that visiting a hospital might ease her concerns about the health of her beloved companion. In any case, she wanted desperately to believe that the sorcerer would help them. On this luminous night, the protagonist began to understand, for the first time in his life, what love truly meant. He saw its manifestation, raw and undeniable. Yet along with this realization, he found himself questioning whether it was worth giving up one's life for the sake of a single day spent with the person they loved. During their encounter, the girl begged to be allowed to materialize outside the sorcerer's domain. When Sul asked why he should even consider doing so, she responded with barely concealed frustration, implying that it seemed he was incapable of granting her wish. But that wasn't the case at all. Sul could easily make it happen, though he doubted Udumbara would survive the process. Perhaps he could modify her power slightly to make it possible, but doing so would mean she would disappear completely afterward. However, this didn't seem to matter to her. She was ready to vanish right now if it meant she could materialize for just one day. For her, existence without such an experience held no meaning. Sol realized that her energy was fading, and he had failed to notice it earlier, distracted by the fact that she had already partially materialized. It was true. She had only one chance left. Beyond that, her strength was utterly insufficient. She had to fulfill her promise at any cost. Yet the sorcerer couldn't understand why this was so important to her. He questioned what held more value, her life or the future. With a bitter smile, Udumbara admitted that she was in love, and the object of her affection was a human. That woman had spent over 40 years in solitude waiting for her. And so it was her duty now to answer those decades of longing. This revelation gave the werewolf the clarity he needed. He began to truly grasp the beauty and power of love. He realized he no longer needed to remain alone. And even Sul found a potential advantage in her unique condition. Meanwhile, the sorcerer contemplated the situation. The energy coursing through Udumbara's body was dwindling rapidly. It seemed that what remained would sustain her for a mere century, far less than the millennium he had initially anticipated. This was grim news, as such power could have greatly advanced his research. Nevertheless, it was better than nothing. Now he needed to find a way to materialize her fully while preserving as much of her strength as possible. At that moment, Elle unexpectedly appeared before him. The protagonist wasted no time explaining that it was now midnight, and he had come to restore his own strength. The sorcerer was taken aback by this, as he was usually the one who had to summon the mercenary. In response, Elle noted that the moon tonight was unusually large and beautiful. Considering the significance of the day, it meant there was a supermoon. a rare celestial event that occurred only once every 50 years. Indeed, today was a special day. Suddenly, El paused and asked whether it was truly necessary for Udumbara to materialize outside. He was referring to the woman Udumbara loved, suggesting it might be simpler to bring her here instead. The quiet of the evening was shattered by loud, boisterous laughter echoing from one of the buildings. Even amidst his amusement, the sorcerer agreed that El's suggestion was, in fact, a brilliant idea. Shifting their perspective suddenly made everything seem much simpler. However, this was not the reaction the protagonist had expected, prompting him to suggest they stop laughing and focus on continuing what they had started. The next day, El and Kuda once again set off on a mission to visit the familiar girl. While El was lost in thought, still dwelling on the events of the previous night, he didn't even notice when they arrived at their destination. However, Kuda, curious and observant as ever, wanted to know what had happened and whether the wolf had fought with their master. After all, the two hadn't so much as exchanged glances since leaving the house. This was untrue. They hadn't fought at all, but El had no desire to discuss it. Perhaps it would be best just to press the button and have the girl come out to meet them. But suddenly, both of them sensed something nearby. It appeared for only a brief moment, but that was enough. Regardless, it would already be too late to chase it, even if they ran after it now. There were a number of possibilities. It could have been following them or merely observing the area. Either way, they decided they would need to consult the sorcerer about it later. Suddenly, a piercing scream ripped through the air, so intense that it was almost unbearable, especially for El, whose hearing was far sharper than most. The voice was unmistakably familiar. It was Udumbara's screams. She was likely losing her sanity as her power continued to drain away. For them, who could sense mana, the sound was dangerous and overwhelming. But for ordinary humans without mana, it would likely go unnoticed. Regardless, they needed to find out what was happening. Unbeknownst to them, however, they were being closely watched. The person monitoring them through cameras had already identified the sorcerer's puppy and found the idea of making him cry incredibly tempting. Not far away, another group, Orto, was stationed in the area, seemingly working on their own objective. Udumbara was in despair, as her beloved vine had suddenly collapsed and was unresponsive to any of her desperate calls. The girl tried with all her might to do something for her, but her hands passed right through Vane's body, highlighting her helplessness. All she could do now was wonder why she couldn't support her, even as she fell. While she frantically sought help, unexpected visitors arrived, determined to understand the situation. They quickly took control of the scene and began assessing what was happening. Tears streaming down her face, Udumbara repeatedly asked if Vine was all right and why she wasn't waking up. After a brief examination, the protagonist determined that while the woman's pulse was weak, her heart was still beating. There was no time to waste. When asked what he planned to do, the protagonist firmly declared that he would take her to the sorcerer. Udumbara, however, insisted they go to a hospital, arguing that the doctors there could provide better care for Havon, as she was an ordinary human. Even Elmas wasn't sure how Sul could help in this situation, but something deep within him told him that the hospital would be of no use. His instincts that had saved his life countless times as a mercenary, were certain of it. Fortunately, his current speed allowed him to transport the woman in the shortest possible time. He was convinced that they had no choice but to meet with the sorcerer, certain that doing so would resolve the situation in the best possible way. Suddenly, they came to an abrupt halt, prompting Udumbara to fear that Vane's condition had worsened. But that wasn't the case. Elmas had sensed something else before anyone else could. Indeed, his instincts were correct. A pack of wolves had appeared, ready to attack. The best course of action now was to hand the ailing woman over to someone else, as Elmas could handle himself much better in battle. His role was clear: deal with the threat and ensure no one interfered with their mission. As always, the enemies attacked as a group, relying on their well-practiced tactics. But the mercenary, familiar with such strategies, knew exactly how to counter them. Seeing that the wolf could manage the situation, Kuda hurried toward the sorcerer's house to deliver the woman. However, he was soon confronted by a new and unexpected danger. A stranger blocked his path, declaring that he couldn't let them go, especially now that he knew a dark sorcerer was involved. The vampire easily dodged the stranger's first attack, but couldn't help but notice his growing irritation toward wolves. Fortunately, a comrade of Kuda's intervened, engaging the enemy and holding him off. This was the kind of fight his ally had spent a lifetime perfecting. Using the distraction to his advantage, Kuda resumed his journey toward the house. At first glance, it was difficult to tell who was dominating or who might emerge victorious. Eventually, the enemy retreated slightly, as if unwilling to continue the fight. Before leaving, the stranger commented that the werewolf before him seemed different.